Three Soviet military flops that secretly scared the West. The T-62 tank, MiG-25 jet, and Typhoon submarine. The Soviet Union was a powerhouse that left a lasting mark on history, and its military-industrial complex was a force to be reckoned with. From tanks to jets to submarines, the Soviets built machines that made the world take notice, sometimes with awe, sometimes with laughter. During the Cold War, the US and its allies loved to poke fun at Soviet tech, calling it outdated, clunky, or just plain useless. But behind the snarky comments was a truth they didn't want to admit. Some of these failures were game changers that kept Pentagon planners up at night. In this deep dive, we're exploring three Soviet military developments that American experts loved to trash: the T-62 tank, the MiG-25 jet, and the Project 941 Typhoon submarine. These machines were mocked as inferior, but their real-world performance told a different story. I'll break down their history, the economic and strategic context, and why they were far more impressive than their critics wanted you to believe. Plus, I'll share my own take on what these machines meant for the world and why their legacy still matters today. Part 1. The T-62 tank, a junk tank that took down Abrams. The birth of the T-62. Picture this. It's the 1960s, the Cold War is heating up, and the U.S. is churning out tanks like the M48 and M60, boasting about their cutting-edge tech. The Soviet Union needed a response, something reliable, mass-producible, and capable of standing up to NATO's best. Enter the T-62, a tank that bridged the gap between the iconic T-55 series and the more advanced T-64 and T-72 models. The T-62 wasn't flashy, but it packed a punch. It was the first tank in the world to roll out with a 115mm smoothbore gun, a revolutionary design that could fire rounds at a blistering 1 kilometer per second, punching through the armor of American tanks like the M48 and M60. Despite this, U.S. analysts called it dud. They said its armor was too thin, its engine too weak, and its tech outdated. But was that the whole story? Why the hate? Let's be real. The Cold War wasn't just about tanks and jets. It was a propaganda war, too. The U.S. wanted the world to believe its military hardware was untouchable, so they downplayed anything Soviet. The T-62 became an easy target. Critics claimed it couldn't hold a candle to American tanks, pointing to its 580 horsepower engine, modest for the time, and armor that wasn't as thick as later models. But here's the thing. The T-62 wasn't trying to be a futuristic superweapon. It was built for mass production, reliability, and battlefield flexibility. The Soviets knew they couldn't match the US dollar for dollar. America's defense budget in the 1960s was around 7 to 10% of its GDP, while the USSR was shelling out 15 to 20%. So, they focused on building tanks that were affordable and effective. The T-62 fit that bill perfectly, with over 20,000 units produced compared to about 15,000 minutes and 60 seconds, which were pricier and more complex to maintain. And let's talk results. In the 1980s, the T-62 proved its worth in the rugged mountains of Afghanistan, where it handled tough terrain and delivered devastating firepower. Even more impressively, during the Second Gulf War, Iraqi T-62s, when used in ambushes, could take out American M1 Abrams tanks by hitting their weaker side armor from long range. That's right, a junk tank was giving the U.S. military's pride and joy a run for its money. The economic angle. To understand the T-62's success, you've got to look at the economics. The Soviet Union's economy in the 1960s was geared towards scale. Factories like Ural-Vaganzavod churned out T-62s by the thousands, keeping costs low and production high. Each tank was a fraction of the cost of an M60, which meant the Soviets could field massive armor divisions, a key part of their strategy to deter NATO. The U.S., with its wealthier economy, could afford to pour money into high-tech tanks, but that came with trade-offs. The M60 was a beast, but its complexity meant longer production times and higher maintenance costs. The T-62, on the other hand, was a workhorse, simple to build, easy to repair, and ready to roll in huge numbers. This economic edge allowed the Soviets to maintain a formidable tank force, even if their GDP was roughly half that of the US during the Cold War. My take: the T-62 is a classic underdog story. It wasn't the sleekest or most advanced tank, but it got the job done. To me, it's a reminder that perfection isn't always the goal. Sometimes, practicality wins. The Soviets understood that a good enough tank in large numbers could outmatch a few fancy ones. And the fact that it could still take out an Abrams in the right conditions, that's a testament to smart engineering and tactical know-how. The American criticism feels like a mix of genuine nitpicking and psychological warfare. By calling the T-62 a failure, they were trying to convince the world, and maybe themselves, that the Soviet threat wasn't real. But history proved them wrong. The T-62 wasn't just a tank. It was a symbol of Soviet resilience. Call to action. What's your take on the T-62? Did the U.S. underestimate it? Or were they right to call it out? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you're loving this deep dive, hit that subscribe button for more. Part 2. The MiG-25, Too Fast, Too Furious. A jet born to dominate. In the 1960s, the U.S. was flexing its muscles with high-altitude, high-speed reconnaissance planes like the State Route 71 Blackbird. These jets could fly at Mach 3 and above 80,000 feet, spying on the Soviets with near impunity. The USSR needed a counter, and they delivered big time with the MiG-25, a jet that could hit Mach 2.5 to 3, climb to the edge of the stratosphere, and take out targets with long-range missiles. The MiG-25 was a beast unlike any other. Its airframe was made of stainless steel, a bold choice that made it heavy but incredibly durable. It could fly faster and higher than almost anything else in the sky, making it the ultimate interceptor for chasing down enemy reconnaissance planes or bombers. When the West got wind of this jet, they were stunned. But instead of admitting its strengths, they went on the attack. The smear campaign. The U.S. got their hands on a MiG-25 in 1976 when Soviet pilot Viktor Belenko defected and flew one to Japan. American engineers tore it apart and came back with a laundry list of complaints. It was a fuel hog, the cockpit visibility was terrible, and it wasn't built for dogfights. They called it a flying barn and said it was useless in combat. Here's the catch. The MiG-25 wasn't designed for dogfights. Its job was to intercept high-flying targets at extreme speeds and altitudes, something it did better than anything else. The U.S. conveniently ignored this, focusing on its weaknesses to paint it as a failure. They even pointed to air battles in the Middle East, where Israeli pilots flying U.S.-made jets took on Syrian MiG-25s and often came out on top. But those fights were carefully orchestrated ambushes, and the MiG-25 still managed to inflict losses. What made it special? The MiG-25's real strength was its raw power. It could hit speeds of 1,800 miles per hour and climb to 65,000 feet, putting it out of reach for most enemy defenses. Its radar and missiles could lock onto targets from miles away, making it a nightmare for any plane trying to infiltrate Soviet airspace. Plus, it wasn't just an interceptor. Its reconnaissance variants could snap photos from altitudes that made them untouchable. Sure, it burned through fuel like nobody's business, but so did the State Route 71. The difference? The Soviets built around 1,200 MiG-25s, while the U.S. only managed 32 SR-71s due to their astronomical cost. The MiG-25 was a practical solution to a real problem, and it gave the Soviets a strategic edge in air defense. The economic and strategic picture. Building a jet like the MiG-25 wasn't cheap. The Soviet Union poured about 10 to 15% of its military budget into aviation during the 1960s and 70s, according to historical estimates. That's billions of dollars in today's money, but it was worth it to counter the U.S. threat. The MiG-25 wasn't just a jet. It was a statement that the USSR could match, and sometimes beat, Western tech. The U.S., with its larger economy, could afford projects like the State Route 71. But they came with limitations. Each State Route 71 flight cost millions, and the program was so expensive that it was retired in the 1990s. The MiG-25, meanwhile, stayed in service for decades, evolving into the MiG-31, which still guards Russian skies today. My take: the MiG-25 is the kind of machine that makes you respect bold engineering. The Soviets didn't play it safe. They built a jet that pushed the limits of what was possible. Was it perfect? No. Was it a game changer? Absolutely. The fact that the U.S. was so eager to get their hands on one shows how much it scared them. Their criticism feels like a desperate attempt to downplay a threat they couldn't fully counter. To me, the MiG-25 is a reminder that innovation often comes from thinking outside the box. The Soviets took risks, and it paid off. Even today, the MiG-25's legacy lives on in its successor, the MiG-31, which continues to set records for speed and altitude. Call to action. Ever heard stories about the MiG-25? Maybe you know someone who saw one in action? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more epic tales of military history. Part 3. The Typhoon Submarine, a Silent Giant. The Monster of the Deep. If you thought the T-62 and MiG-25 were impressive, wait until you meet the Project 941 Typhoon submarine, known to NATO as the Typhoon class. These beasts were the largest submarines ever built, stretching 570 feet long and displacing 48,000 tons. Built in the 1980s to counter America's Ohio-class subs, which carried Trident missiles, the Typhoons were armed with 20 R-39 ballistic missiles, each capable of delivering up to 10 nuclear warheads. That's enough firepower to reshape the world map. The Typhoon was a marvel of engineering, designed to operate for months underwater and strike from the depths. But, as you might guess, the U.S. wasn't about to give the Soviets credit. They called the Typhoon noisy, easy to detect, and a sitting duck for American anti-submarine warfare. Debunking the myths. The biggest knock against the Typhoon was its supposed noisiness. American experts claimed it was so loud that U.S. sonar could pick it up from miles away. This narrative got a boost from pop culture, with Tom Clancy's The Hunt for Red October portraying a Typhoon-like sub as an easy target for the U.S. Navy. The book and movie suggested that American sailors could track and sink these subs without breaking a sweat. But reality was far different. The Soviets prioritized stealth in the Typhoon's design, and while early models had some acoustic issues, later versions were much quieter. In fact, during the 1980s, Soviet subs, including Typhoons and other classes, pulled off two daring operations, a port into Trina, where they slipped close to U.S. shores without being detected. These missions left the U.S. Navy scrambling to explain how they'd been outmaneuvered. The economic and strategic stakes. Building a Typhoon wasn't cheap. Each sub cost the equivalent of several $billions. The Soviet Union's naval budget in the 1980s ate up about 10% of its military spending, reflecting the importance of a strong submarine fleet in their nuclear deterrent strategy. The Typhoon wasn't just a weapon. It was a floating fortress that ensured the USSR could retaliate against any nuclear strike. The U.S. Ohio-class subs were also expensive, costing around $2 billion each in 1980s dollars. But the Soviets built 6 Typhoons, each with unmatched firepower, while the U.S. fielded 18 Ohio-class subs. The smaller number of Typhoons didn't diminish their impact. They were a constant reminder that the USSR could strike from the sea, no matter the odds. My take: the Typhoon is the ultimate symbol of Soviet ambition. These subs were massive, powerful, and terrifying, a true embodiment of the Cold War's high stakes. The American criticism feels like a coping mechanism. They couldn't admit that the Soviets had built something so formidable, so they leaned on the noisy narrative to save face. But operations like a port and a Trina proved the Typhoon was a silent giant, capable of outsmarting the best the U.S. Navy had to offer. To me, the Typhoon is a reminder that perception isn't reality. The U.S. wanted the world to see these subs as flawed, but their real-world performance told a different story. It makes you wonder what other Soviet tech was underestimated, and what lessons we can learn from that today. The T-62, MiG-25, and Typhoon submarine weren't just machines. They were symbols of a nation's determination to compete on the world stage. The Soviet Union faced economic challenges, political pressure, and relentless criticism, but they built hardware that could go toe-to-toe with the West. American experts called them failures, but the truth came out in battlefields, skies, and oceans around the world. These machines teach us that strength isn't always about perfection. It's about adaptability, ingenuity, and getting the job done. The T-62 proved that a practical tank could outshine a flashy one. The MiG-25 showed that bold risks could redefine what's possible. And the Typhoon reminded us that even the biggest giants can move in silence. Today, as new technologies and global rivalries shape our world, the story of these Soviet creations feels more relevant than ever. They're a lesson in not underestimating your opponent, and in recognizing the power of innovation under pressure. Final call to action. If you enjoyed this deep dive, give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what you think about these Soviet machines, or let us know what other military legends you want us to cover. Your support keeps these stories alive. Let's keep the conversation going.